As the conflict has continued, growing attention has shifted from the battlefield to the decision-making process inside Washington. Reports from major media outlets suggest that policymakers are still debating how to achieve long-term objectives while avoiding a wider regional confrontation. Public statements have alternated between firm military warnings and renewed calls for diplomacy, creating the impression of an evolving strategy rather than a clearly defined plan. At the same time, discussions within national security circles reportedly reflect efforts to identify new options that could increase pressure without triggering a larger conflict. These developments have fueled questions among analysts about whether the United States is adapting to changing conditions or struggling to establish a sustainable strategic direction. One of the most noticeable features of this conflict has been the contrast between official messaging and events unfolding on the ground. Public statements have repeatedly alternated between warnings of stronger military action and renewed optimism about diplomatic progress. While such shifts are not uncommon during international crises, the frequency of these changes has drawn increasing attention from political observers and security analysts. This evolving narrative has created uncertainty among allies, financial markets, and regional governments attempting to anticipate Washington's next move. Announcements suggesting negotiations may be close have often been followed by tougher rhetoric, while discussions of escalation have later been replaced by calls for restraint. As a result, many analysts argue that public communication has become increasingly reactive to developments rather than reflecting a fixed long-term strategy. From a geopolitical perspective, consistency is an important component of deterrence and diplomacy. When messaging changes rapidly, competing governments may interpret those shifts in different ways, potentially influencing their own strategic calculations. Whether these adjustments represent tactical flexibility or the challenges of responding to a rapidly changing conflict remains a subject of ongoing debate. What is clear, however, is that the gap between political messaging and battlefield realities has become one of the defining characteristics of the current crisis. While the conflict is primarily centered on the United States and Iran, its consequences are felt most directly by America's regional partners. Several Gulf nations have spent decades building economies that rely heavily on stable energy exports, secure shipping lanes, and uninterrupted international trade. For these countries, a prolonged military confrontation presents serious economic and security risks that extend well beyond the battlefield. As tensions have increased, reports have suggested that regional governments have encouraged restraint rather than further escalation. Their concerns are understandable. Critical infrastructure, including energy facilities, ports, desalination plants, and transportation networks, represents the backbone of their economies. Any disruption could affect domestic stability while also influencing global oil supplies and international commodity markets. These governments must also balance their long-standing security partnerships with the United States against the practical realities of living in a region where military exchanges can quickly spread across national borders. Even if they are not directly involved in combat operations, they remain exposed to the economic and strategic consequences of any wider conflict. This explains why many regional partners increasingly view diplomacy and controlled de-escalation as the most effective path toward protecting both their national interests and the broader stability of the Middle East. Beyond the headlines and political rhetoric, another issue has become increasingly important: military logistics. Modern conflicts are not determined solely by battlefield performance, but also by a nation's ability to sustain operations over time. Every interception, precision strike, and defensive action depends on a steady supply of advanced missiles, replacement equipment, and industrial production capable of replenishing military stockpiles. Recent reports have highlighted growing concerns about the pace at which key munitions are being consumed. Defense analysts note that high-intensity operations place enormous pressure on supply chains, particularly when sophisticated missile systems require years to manufacture rather than weeks. Maintaining readiness, therefore, becomes a balance between supporting ongoing operations and preserving resources for other potential global commitments. This challenge extends beyond military planning and into economic strategy. Expanding defense production demands significant financial investment, skilled labor, and industrial capacity, all while governments continue to manage domestic spending priorities. As the conflict continues, questions are increasingly being raised about whether long-term logistical sustainability could become just as influential as tactical success. In modern warfare, maintaining the ability to support prolonged operations is often as decisive as success on the battlefield itself. Rather than relying on conventional military superiority, Iran is focused on a strategy designed to increase the costs of prolonged confrontation. Security analysts have long argued that Tehran's approach emphasizes patience, regional influence, and the ability to apply pressure through multiple channels instead of seeking decisive battlefield victories. This strategy aims to complicate an opponent's planning while gradually shifting the strategic balance over time. A key element of this approach involves maintaining influence across several areas of the Middle East, allowing Iran to respond to developments without concentrating all of its resources in one location. At the same time, Tehran has sought to demonstrate that continued military pressure could carry wider regional consequences, encouraging neighboring governments to favor diplomatic solutions over further escalation. From Washington's perspective, this creates a complex strategic environment. Every additional military decision must be weighed against the possibility of broader regional instability, higher economic costs, and increased pressure on U.S. allies. As a result, many observers believe the conflict has evolved into a contest of endurance rather than rapid military success. In this type of geopolitical competition, the ability to sustain political influence, economic resilience, and regional partnerships can become just as important as traditional military capabilities. Although military operations dominate the headlines, the economic consequences of the conflict may ultimately prove even more significant. The Middle East remains one of the world's most important energy-producing regions, and any disruption to oil exports or major shipping routes can quickly ripple through the global economy. Even the possibility of instability is enough to influence commodity prices, freight costs, insurance premiums, and investor sentiment. One of the biggest concerns for financial markets is the security of key maritime trade corridors that transport millions of barrels of crude oil every day. If shipping traffic slows or transportation risks increase, energy prices can rise sharply, placing additional pressure on inflation and increasing operating costs for businesses worldwide. Higher fuel prices also affect manufacturing, aviation, agriculture, and consumer spending, creating broader economic challenges far beyond the region itself. For governments and investors alike, the conflict is therefore more than a geopolitical issue. It is also an economic risk that requires constant monitoring. Decisions made by political leaders can influence not only regional stability, but also financial markets across the globe. This close connection between security and economics explains why developments in the region continue to receive such intense attention from policymakers, central banks, and international investors alike. As the conflict has continued, international attention has increasingly shifted from military developments to broader questions about strategic credibility. Governments, policy institutes, financial analysts, and global media have all been assessing whether the current approach is strengthening or weakening the United States' long-term position in the region. These discussions extend beyond immediate military outcomes and focus on the future of diplomacy, alliance management, and global influence. Several analysts argue that prolonged conflicts often reshape international perceptions, regardless of which side possesses greater military capabilities. Allies closely watch how commitments are maintained, while rivals evaluate consistency, decision-making, and the willingness to sustain long-term objectives. At the same time, investors monitor geopolitical stability because shifts in international confidence can influence capital flows, commodity markets, and economic expectations. The broader debate is therefore no longer limited to battlefield developments. Instead, it centers on how this conflict may affect America's diplomatic standing, regional partnerships, and ability to project influence in future crises. Whether current policies ultimately reinforce U.S. leadership or encourage competing powers to expand their own influence will likely depend on how the conflict evolves in the months ahead, making international perception an increasingly important strategic factor.